My parents wrote a check for $200,000 to secure my brother's future, then told me that girls do not need degrees because we just need to find husbands. 15 years later, at a lavish engagement party, my father raised his glass to toast my brother as his only successful child. I nearly walked out until the bride stared at my ring and called my name like she had been searching for me. My name is Stella Watson, and I am 34 years old. I grew up in Bellevue, Washington, a place that people like to describe as perfect. It is a sterile sort of perfection, the kind where the lawns are manicured to within a millimeter of their lives, and the silence in the streets is heavy with judgment. In Bellevue, your reputation is the only currency that matters. The truth is just an inconvenient byproduct that you sweep under the expensive rugs in the foyer. We lived in a house that looked like a showroom, void of dust and void of warmth. My father, Richard Watson, was the CFO of a mid-sized financial corporation called Everpine Holdings. He treated our family exactly like he treated his company. There were assets and there were liabilities. There were investments, and there were sunk costs. For a long time, I did not realize which category I fell into. I was 18 years old when the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. It was a Tuesday evening in late April. The acceptance letter from the state university was sitting on the kitchen island. It was the only thing I had looked at for 3 days. I had worked hard for that acceptance. I had studied while my brother Grant was out partying. I had kept my grades perfect while my mother, Diane, fussed over social calendars and dinner parties. I thought that if I presented the letter to my father like a quarterly report, he would see the value in it. I thought he would see the value in me. I stood in the kitchen while he drank his scotch. The ice clinked against the crystal glass, a sound that to this day makes my stomach tighten. I asked him for tuition assistance. I had the numbers written down. I had a plan for a part-time job to cover books and living expenses. I just needed him to cover the tuition. He looked at me over the rim of his glass. He did not yell. Richard Watson never yelled because yelling was a loss of control, and my father was all about control. He set the glass down and gave me a look that was not angry, but purely dismissive. It was the look you give a waiter who has brought you the wrong order. He told me that girls do not need degrees. He said that finding a decent husband was enough. He spoke with such absolute certainty that for a split second, I wondered if I was the one who was crazy. He told me that my role was to support a family, not to build a career. He told me that investing in my education was unnecessary when my future was domestic. I stood there, frozen, feeling the blood drain from my face. I wanted to scream that I was smart. I wanted to scream that I had plans. But in that kitchen, with the stainless steel appliances gleaming under the recessed lighting, my voice died in my throat. The crushing blow came less than an hour later. My younger brother Grant walked in. Grant was the golden boy. He was charismatic and loud and entirely mediocre in every academic sense. He had barely scraped through high school. Yet, that same evening, my parents sat him down at that same kitchen island. My father pulled out his checkbook. It was a long, leather-bound book that smelled of old money. He uncapped his fountain pen and wrote out a check for $200,000. He handed it to Grant with a smile I had never seen directed at me. They told him it was for his future. They told him it was for a prestigious program that would set him up for life. They were beaming. Grant looked at the check, grinned, and pocketed it like it was $20 for pizza. That moment broke something inside me. It was not just jealousy, it was clarity. I realized that in the ledger of the Watson family, Grant was the venture capital project, and I was the insurance policy waiting to be transferred to someone else. I looked at my father, who was clapping Grant on the shoulder. I looked at my mother, who was already planning the dinner where she would brag to her friends about Grant's acceptance into this elite program. I looked at the check in my brother's pocket. I made a decision right then and there. I decided that from that day forward, I would not ask them for anything. Not a dime, not a favor, not even advice. If they saw me as a liability, I would remove myself from their balance sheet entirely. I walked out of that kitchen and I went to my room. I did not cry. I packed a bag. I looked at the acceptance letter from the state university, and I swore to myself that I would go, even if I had to crawl there. The next 4 years were a blur of exhaustion. I moved out 2 weeks after graduation. My parents barely noticed. They were too busy organizing a farewell brunch for Grant. I found a tiny apartment that smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes, a stark contrast to the antiseptic cleanliness of my childhood home. I took on 3 jobs. I worked the breakfast shift at a diner from 5 in the morning until 11. I rushed to classes, fighting to stay awake during lectures. In the afternoons, I worked as a teaching assistant, grading papers until my eyes crossed. At night, I took the graveyard shift monitoring the university computer lab because it allowed me to study during the quiet hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. I learned the value of $1 in a way my brother never would. I learned that sleep is a luxury. I learned that hunger is a sharp, physical pain that sits in the center of your chest. I ate instant noodles and day-old bread. I taped my shoes when the soles wore out because buying a new pair meant missing rent. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I wrote essays about hardship and determination, stripping my soul bare for committees of strangers just to get $500 here or $1,000 there. There were times when I wanted to quit. There were nights when I sat in the fluorescent hum of the computer lab, staring at a spreadsheet, and thought about calling home. I thought about begging. But then I would remember the look on my father's face. I would remember the casual way he dismissed my entire potential. I would remember the $200,000 handed to a boy who had never worked a day in his life. And that anger would burn in my gut like high-octane fuel. I learned to turn that being overlooked into energy. I learned to convert their dismissal into ambition. My parents had no idea what I was studying when I occasionally saw them at holidays. They never asked. They would ask if I was seeing anyone. They would ask if I had found a nice boy. They never asked about my GPA. They never asked about the awards I was winning. They did not know that I had discovered a talent for numbers that far exceeded my father's corporate maneuvering. They did not know that I was learning to track financial discrepancies. They did not know that the career I was choosing was one that specialized in finding the truth buried under layers of lies. That is the irony that keeps me warm at night. My father thought he was dismissing me to a life of domestic obscurity. He thought he was cutting me off. What he was actually doing was creating the very instrument of his own undoing. He was forging me in the fire of neglect. What they do not know is that the skills I honed during those long, lonely nights in the computer lab are exactly the skills that will strip their facade away. They created a forensic accountant who specializes in fraud, and they did it by telling her she wasn't smart enough to need a degree. There is a moment coming that I have replayed in my head 1,000 times. It is a moment that happens 15 years after that check was written. It happens at an engagement party that costs more than my entire college education. It is the night my father stands up in front of hundreds of Bellevue's elite. He taps a crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room goes quiet. He raises a glass of vintage champagne. He points to Grant, and he says the words that seal his fate. He calls Grant his only successful child. He says it with pride. He says it with that arrogant certainty that has defined his entire life. He ignores me standing in the shadows. He ignores the woman I have become. But I am getting ahead of myself. That night does not end the way he thinks it will. That night ends with a stranger looking at the ring on my finger and saying my name like she has found a ghost. I know there are people out there listening to this who know exactly what this feels like. If you have ever been the invisible child in your own home, if you have ever been told you are less than because of your gender or your choices, I want you to go down to the comments right now if you have ever been looked over while someone else got the golden ticket. Simply comment the phrase "I understand," because I know you do. I know that burn. I know that silence. Back then, standing in that kitchen at 18, I looked at that check for $200,000. I watched my brother fold it. To my parents, that check was an investment in their son. To Grant, it was a lottery ticket. But to me, as I stood there with my rejected request and my clenched fists, that check was a one-way ticket. It was the price of my freedom. They thought they were paying for his success, but they were actually buying my independence. They just didn't know it yet. I took one last look at their happy, delusional faces, turned my back on the life I was supposed to live, and walked out the door to build a new one from scratch, to understand the ecosystem of the Watson household. You first have to understand the invisible constitution that governed our lives. It was never written down or framed on the wall, but it was enforced with the rigor of a federal law. The first article of that constitution was simple. My brother, Grant, was the capital project. He was the skyscraper my father was building to touch the clouds. I, on the other hand, was the insurance policy. I was the backup generator kept in the basement, only to be thought of if the main power grid failed. And even then, my purpose was strictly utilitarian. My father, Richard Watson, was the chief financial officer of Everpine Holdings. It was a mid-sized financial firm that managed wealth for people who had summer homes in the San Juan Islands. He carried his job home with him like a contagious disease. He did not see a family. He saw a portfolio, and like any decent portfolio manager, he knew where to allocate his resources for the highest perceived return on investment. In his mind, investing in a son was building a dynasty. Investing in a daughter was throwing money into a hole because, eventually, she would change her last name and become someone else's asset. The symbol of his authority was not his voice, which was always terrifyingly level, but his watch. It was a heavy gold piece that cost more than most people's cars. He wore it like a shackle of power. I remember the way he would sit at the head of the dining table, checking the time with an exaggerated flick of his wrist. It was a gesture that said his time was the most valuable commodity in the room, and we were lucky he was spending a fraction of it on us. He treated dinner like a board meeting where the agenda was always the glorification of Grant. My mother, Diane, was the vice president of public relations in this domestic corporation. Her job was to make sure the neighbors saw a perfect nuclear family. She smoothed over the cracks if my father made a cutting remark. She would laugh a nervous, tinkling laugh and pass the bread rolls. She was the great neutralizer. She kept the peace not by solving problems, but by burying them under layers of polite conversation and denial. She loved me, I think, in the way one loves an old piece of furniture that doesn't quite match the new decor, but can't be thrown out. She was always trying to sand down my edges to make me fit. The allocation of resources in our house was almost comical in its disparity. Grant struggled in school from the moment he learned to read. So, the resources flowed. He had private tutors for math, for science, and even for history. When his grades didn't improve, they hired an expensive educational consultant who specialized in learning styles. When he showed a vague interest in tennis, he was outfitted with the best rackets and sent to a camp in California that cost $5,000 for 2 weeks. He was driven everywhere. My father bought him a brand new sedan the day he turned 16 because, as he put it, a young man needs mobility to build his network. I was different. I was sharp. I was hungry. But because I was capable, I was ignored. While Grant was being chauffeured to his private coaching sessions, I was navigating the King County Metro bus system in the rain. I learned the bus schedules by heart. I learned how to do my homework on a moving vehicle with bad suspension. When I needed a graphing calculator for advanced calculus, my father told me to ask the school if they had a loaner program. He said it with a straight face, wearing a suit that cost $2,000. I remember coming home one afternoon in my junior year. I was glowing. I had won first place in a regional academic decathlon. It was a big deal. I had beaten students from the top private schools in Seattle. I walked into the kitchen, the medal heavy and cool in my hand, and placed it on the granite countertop right next to my father's Scotch glass. He looked at the medal, then he looked at me. He didn't ask about the competition. He didn't ask what subjects I had excelled in. He took a sip of his drink and asked me if I had a boyfriend yet. He asked if I was making an effort to be more social because boys don't like girls who are too intense. I felt the air leave the room. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend me, to say that her daughter was brilliant. She just smiled that tight, fearful smile and told me that my father only wanted what was best for me. She told me that happiness for a woman comes from stability. And I should listen to him, that was the mantra. He wants what is best for you. It was the lie she told herself so she could sleep at night. Over time, I realized the truth. They did not hate me. Hate would have implied passion. Hate would have meant I mattered enough to provoke a reaction. This was worse. This was indifference based on calculation. They did not see me as a bad person. They just didn't see me as an investment vehicle. I was a depreciating asset. Why pour money into a girl who is just going to get married? Why fix her teeth perfectly or send her to a top-tier college when her primary function is to run a household? It was cold. Corporate logic applied to flesh and blood. This realization created a scar on my personality that hardened into armor. I became aggressively self-reliant. I stopped asking for things. I stopped asking for rides. I stopped asking for money for movies or clothes. I hoarded my allowance. And when that stopped, I started doing odd jobs for neighbors. I mowed lawns. I organized garages. I developed a phobia of debt. To this day, the idea of owing someone a favor makes my skin crawl. I learned to view every interaction as a transaction, where I had to ensure I wasn't in the red. I became disciplined to the point of rigidity. If I said I would do something, I did it. If I needed something, I earned it. I refused to be the helpless girl they expected me to be. There was a moment, though, that changed everything. It wasn't with my family. It was with a total stranger. I was working a shift at a diner during my senior year of high school. It was a Sunday morning rush, chaotic and loud. A group of businessmen had come in, ordering complicated breakfasts and modifying every item. When it came time to pay, their bill was a mess. The register had frozen, and they were impatient. I pulled out a pad of paper and manually calculated the split for 6 people, factoring in tax and different tip percentages, and reconciling a mistake on the menu price for the omelets, all in about 45 seconds. One of the men, a guy with gray hair and sharp eyes, stopped gathering his coat. He looked at the pad where I had scribbled the numbers. He looked at the speed of my calculation. He didn't flirt. He didn't smile. He looked at me with a kind of professional intensity I had never seen before. He told me that I had a mind for forensic auditing. He said that most people look at numbers and see math, but I looked at numbers and saw the story. He left a $20 tip and walked out. I never saw him again, but that sentence lodged in my brain like a bullet. You see the story. I realized then that numbers were not just cold facts. They were evidence. They were tracks in the snow. But the final nail in the coffin of my childhood was that dinner when I was 18. It was the week of the check. The week Grant got his $200,000 and I got my dismissal. We were sitting at the dining table. The roast beef was dry. The conversation was centered, as always, on Grant's bright future. My father was expounding on the connections Grant would make in his new program. He was talking about internships and golf clubs. I sat there, cutting my meat into tiny, precise squares. I looked around the table. I saw my mother, nodding enthusiastically at everything my father said, terrified of a moment of silence. I saw Grant, smug and comfortable, taking it all as his birthright, and I saw my father, checking his watch, satisfied that his project was proceeding according to schedule. No one looked at me. No one asked about my plans. No one asked how I was going to pay for the university I was determined to attend. I was a ghost in my own house. I was invisible. And in that silence, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my safety net, I made a vow. I looked at the heavy curtains and the expensive china and the lie of a happy family, and I swore that I would never let anyone determine my value again. I swore that I would take the invisible status they had forced on me and I would use it. If they couldn't see me, they wouldn't see me coming. I ate my dry roast beef, drank my water, and let the silence wash over me, knowing it was the last time I would ever truly sit at this table as their daughter. I was already gone. They just hadn't noticed the empty chair yet. I packed my life into 3 cardboard boxes and drove my beat-up sedan 2 hours east to North Cascades State University. It was not the Ivy League. It was not the prestigious program my brother Grant was bragging about attending on the other side of the country. It was a massive, concrete campus filled with commuters and kids who, like me, were calculating the cost of every textbook down to the cent. I declared my major on the first day, accounting and data analysis. It was not sexy. It was not something you discussed at cocktail parties to impress people, but I did not choose it for the glamour. I chose it because I had learned early that in a world of social posturing and corporate spin, numbers were the only language that did not know how to lie. Numbers were the language of power. If you controlled the ledger, you knew where the bodies were buried. My life for those 4 years became a blur of motion and caffeine. I did not have the luxury of the typical college experience. There were no frat parties, no tailgates, no lazy Sunday mornings recovering from a hangover. I had a gap between my tuition and the patchwork of scholarships I had scraped together. Plus, I had rent to pay for a room in a shared house that smelled permanently of wet dog. To survive, I constructed a schedule that would have killed a weaker person. I took on 3 jobs, and I held on to them with a grip of iron. The first was the morning shift at a diner called the Rusty Spoon just off campus. I was there at 5 in the morning, 5 days a week. I can still smell the mixture of industrial-strength bleach and bacon grease that seemed to seep into my pores. My uniform was a polyester nightmare that I washed in the sink every night. I learned to carry 4 plates up one arm. I learned to pour coffee without looking. I learned that the construction workers tipped better than the professors, and that a smile, no matter how fake, could earn me an extra $2. $2 was a load of laundry. $2 was a loaf of bread. Every coin mattered. My second job was the evening shift at the university library. This was the graveyard of social lives, from 6 in the evening until closing at midnight. I shelved books. It was physical, repetitive work. My back ached constantly, but the silence was a gift. In the quiet hum of the stacks, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, I could think. I could let the noise of the diner fade away. It was there, hiding in the back rows of the reference section, that I did most of my reading. The third job was my weekend hustle. I tutored freshmen in remedial math. These were kids who had driven new cars to campus, kids whose parents were paying full tuition without blinking, yet they could not calculate a simple percentage. I charged $20 an hour. I sat with them in the student union, explaining basic algebra while they checked their phones and complained about how hard their lives were. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to shake them. I wanted to scream that they had no idea what hard was. Hard was choosing between buying a textbook or paying the electric bill. Hard was stealing rolls of toilet paper from the library bathroom because you could not afford to buy a pack at the store. I became a master of efficiency. I lived on a diet that would have horrified a nutritionist. Instant noodles were a staple, bought in bulk when they were on sale. I ate the mistakes from the diner kitchen: burnt toast, cold eggs, pancakes that had sat under the heat lamp too long. I slept 4 or 5 hours a night, usually in 2 separate shifts. I learned to nap anywhere. There is a specific memory that defines that era for me. It was February of my sophomore year. My car, which acted as my mobile locker and occasional study hall, had a heater that only worked when the vehicle was moving. I had a 2-hour gap between my classes and my shift at the library. I couldn't afford the gas to drive back to my apartment, so I sat in the parking lot in the freezing rain. I was wrapped in a blanket I kept in the trunk. I was studying for an intermediate accounting exam. I looked down at my shoes. The sole of my right sneaker had come loose weeks ago. I had used super glue to fix it, but the water had dissolved the bond. My sock was wet. I was cold. I was hungry. And I was staring at a complex amortization schedule on my lap. I remember feeling a wave of despair so heavy it almost crushed me. But then, I forced myself to solve the problem. I balanced the sheet. The numbers lined up. The logic held. And in that tiny victory, in that cold car with my wet foot, I felt a spark of warmth. I was doing this. I was building a brain that no one could take away from me. I stopped going home for holidays. The first Thanksgiving, my mother called and asked when I would be arriving. I told her I had to work. It was a lie, but only a partial one. I could have swapped shifts, but the thought of sitting at that table, Watching my father carve the turkey while he praised Grant's latest mediocre achievement made me physically ill. I knew Grant was burning through the money they had given him. I saw his social media posts, trips to Cabo, VIP tables at clubs, designer clothes. He was living the life of a millionaire on a student's budget, and my parents were applauding him for it. I could not witness it without screaming, so I chose solitude. I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my apartment, eating a turkey sandwich from a deli, reviewing tax law case studies. It was lonely, yes, but it was peaceful. It was a peace bought with my own labor, and that made it taste better than any feast my mother ever cooked. It was in my junior year that the trajectory of my life shifted permanently. I was taking a course on auditing theory. The professor was a man named Dr. Vance. He was terrifying. He was a former federal auditor who had put people in prison. He did not tolerate laziness. Most students hated him. I loved him. One afternoon, he asked me to stay after class. I thought I had failed an assignment. I stood by his desk, clutching my backpack, ready for a lecture. He tossed my final paper onto the desk. It was marked with red ink, but not corrections. He had circled my analysis of a fraudulent company's cash flow statement. He looked at me over his spectacles and told me that I had an investigative mind. He said that most accountants look for compliance, but I looked for the anomaly. He told me I was naturally suspicious. He meant it as a compliment. He said I should consider forensic accounting. He told me that forensic accountants are the detectives of the financial world. We don't just count the beans. We find out who stole them and how they tried to hide the empty sack. That conversation was the spark. I switched my focus immediately. I dove into forensic auditing. I learned about money laundering schemes. I learned about shell companies and offshore accounts. I learned how executives hide losses and inflate profits. And as I learned, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It was about justice. My entire life, I had felt the injustice of my family's dynamic, the unfairness of the resource allocation, the blindness to the truth. Forensic accounting gave me a tool to fix that. In the world of ledgers, you could not charm your way out of a lie. You could not use your reputation to cover a deficit. If the money was missing, the math would reveal it. I fell in love with the brutality of the truth. By the time graduation approached, I was exhausted, thin, and harder than I had ever been. I had a job offer lined up at the Cascadia Financial Integrity Office. It wasn't the highest-paying offer I received, but it was the one that promised the most action. I wanted to hunt. I sent an invitation to the graduation ceremony to my parents. I did it out of obligation, perhaps a tiny, dying ember of hope that they would want to see me cross the finish line. 2 days before the ceremony, I received a text message from my mother, not a call, a text. It said that something had come up with Grant, some minor crisis involving his apartment lease or a car trouble. I can't even remember the excuse, and they would not be able to make it up to see me. They said they were proud and would send a card. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the phone. I didn't cry. The tears were gone years ago. Instead, a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Of course they wouldn't come. Why would they celebrate the insurance policy? I put the phone down and went to my shift at the diner. Graduation day was a sea of black gowns and colorful flowers. Families were everywhere, hugging, crying, taking photos. Fathers were holding their daughters. Mothers were adjusting mortarboards. I walked through the crowd alone. I sat in my assigned seat, surrounded by strangers. When they called my name, Stella Watson, summa cum laude. I walked across that stage with my head high. I shook the dean's hand. I took the diploma. I looked out into the audience, not searching for faces that weren't there, but looking at the world that I was about to enter. I was alone, but I was debt-free. I was educated, and I was dangerous. I did not know it then. As I held that piece of paper, I had no idea that the very skills I had mastered to survive the ability to track a dollar through a maze of deceit, the patience to stare at a spreadsheet until the pattern emerged, were the weapons I would one day use to dismantle the golden pedestal my parents had built for Grant. I thought I was just becoming an accountant. I didn't realize I was becoming the nemesis of my own family's lies. After the ceremony, I did not go to a party. I drove to a pawn shop on the edge of town. I had saved a little bit of money from my tutoring gigs. I walked in and looked at the jewelry case. I wasn't looking for something expensive. I wanted a token. I found a simple silver band with a small, semi-precious blue stone. It cost me $80. I bought it. I walked out to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and slid the ring onto my right hand. My father had told me to find a husband. He had told me that was my path to security. I looked at the ring on my finger. It caught the afternoon sun. It wasn't a promise from a man. It was a promise from me to me. It was a reminder that I had fed myself. I had housed myself. I had educated myself. I did not need a husband to save me. I did not need my father's money to validate me. I was my own investment. I started the engine of my car, turned up the radio, and drove away from the university, leaving the girl I used to be in the rearview mirror. I was ready for the war, even if I didn't know the battle lines had already been drawn. The glass doors of the Cascadia Financial Integrity Office are frosted, obscuring the view from the outside. It is a deliberate design choice. We do not want people to see in, but more importantly, we do not want the people we are investigating to know we are looking at them until it is too late. To the casual observer walking past our building in downtown Seattle, we look like a boring insurance firm or perhaps a low-level data processing center. That is exactly how we like it. Boredom is an excellent camouflage for danger. My official title is Senior Forensic Analyst, but that does not quite capture the reality of my existence. I am a hunter. I do not hunt with a rifle or a bow. I hunt with algorithms, spreadsheets, and an obsessive attention to the minutiae of wire transfers. My prey are the liars of the corporate world. They are the executives who siphon millions into offshore shell companies while telling their employees that layoffs are necessary. They are the charity directors who use donation funds to pay for their mistresses' apartments. I have learned that human beings are capable of an infinite variety of lies. But money is stubbornly honest. Money leaves a trail. It has a scent. And over the last decade, I have developed a nose that can smell a fraudulent ledger from 3 blocks away. I have also learned the art of silence. In my line of work, you do not talk about your day. You do not discuss active investigations at a bar. You hold your secrets close to your chest, tight enough that they leave an imprint on your skin. This professional silence suited my personal life perfectly because I had no one to talk to anyway. My parents and I had settled into a rhythm of estrangement that was broken only by the occasional obligatory phone call on major holidays. These calls were brief, superficial, and always centered on the weather or Grant's supposed triumphs. I was sitting at my desk on a rainy Tuesday, cross-referencing a series of suspicious invoices from a construction firm in Portland, when my personal phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was my mother. It was the middle of the workday, which was unusual. My mother respected the hours of 9 to 5, not because she respected my career, but because she believed that interrupting business hours was gauche. I let it go to voicemail, finished my analysis, and then called her back during my lunch break. Her voice was breathless, vibrating with that specific frequency of anxiety and excitement that always preceded a demand. She told me that Grant was getting engaged. She told me that he had finally found the perfect girl, a woman named Claire Sloan who came from a very good family. She emphasized the phrase good family with a weight that implied my own bloodline was somehow improved by the association. They were holding an engagement party that coming Saturday at the Lake Washington Yacht Club. I knew the place. It was old money. It was the kind of establishment where membership was inherited, not bought, and the waiters knew which members preferred their gin from a specific distillery in London. It was exactly the kind of stage my father loved. He could stand on the deck, holding a drink, and pretend he was the patriarch of a dynasty rather than a man who had leveraged his daughter's future to pay for his son's mediocrity. I intended to say no. I had a stack of case files on my desk that were far more interesting than watching Grant preen in a tuxedo. But then my mother dropped her voice, her tone shifting from excitement to a hushed, conspiratorial command. She told me that it was very important I attend. She said that appearances mattered. She said that people would ask questions if Grant's sister was not there to support him. And then came the kicker. The sentence that made my grip tighten around my phone until my knuckles turned white. She told me to please not mention my job. She asked me to just say I worked in administration or data entry. She said that my father did not like the idea of his daughter digging through people's financial trash. She said it sounded aggressive. She said it might make the guests uncomfortable. I sat there in the break room, listening to the hum of the vending machine. The request was so insulting, so perfectly indicative of their worldview, that it almost made me laugh. They did not want the successful forensic accountant. They wanted the prop. They wanted the silent, supportive sister who would smile in the background and not threaten the narrative that Grant was the star of the show. I told her I would be there. I did not agree to her conditions, but I did not argue with them either. I simply said I would attend. I hung up the phone with a cold resolve settling in my stomach. I was not going for them. I was not going to celebrate Grant. I was going because I needed to see it one last time. I needed to see the farce with my own eyes. Now that I was an adult who understood how the world actually worked, I wanted to close the chapter. I wanted to look at them and feel nothing. However, there was another reason I decided to go. It was a reason I did not share with my mother. It was a reason that sat in my email inbox, buried under a pile of spam and newsletters. 3 days before my mother called, I had received an email. It was sent to my personal address, which is not easy to find. The sender was anonymous, a generic address made of random letters and numbers. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only one sentence. Grant Watson, do not believe what he says. That was it. No signature, no context, just 8 words that landed in my digital lap like a grenade. In my line of work, we call this a tip-off. Usually, tip-offs are driven by vengeance or jealousy. Sometimes they are crazy, but sometimes they are the loose thread that unravels the entire sweater. I had stared at that email for an hour. I had run a basic trace on the IP address, but it led to a public library computer in downtown Seattle. A dead end. I could have dug deeper. I could have pulled Grant's credit report. I could have run his name through the databases I had access to at work. But I hesitated. There is a line between professional diligence and personal obsession, and I had spent 15 years trying to pretend Grant did not exist. Crossing that line felt like admitting he still had power over me. So I did nothing with the email. I left it there, unread by anyone but me. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. If someone knew enough to find my email address and warn me, then Grant was involved in something messy. And if Grant was involved in something messy, my parents were likely funding it, blindly and joyfully. Saturday arrived with a gray, weeping sky, typical for the Pacific Northwest. I spent the morning preparing. My mother had texted me one final instruction. Dress simply. Do not outshine your brother or Claire. It was a redundant command. I had no intention of wearing a ball gown. I chose a navy blue sheath dress. It was structured, severe, and expensive. It was the kind of dress a woman wears when she is firing a board of directors. It fit me like a suit of armor. I pulled my hair back into a tight chignon. I applied minimal makeup. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who deals in serious matters. Before I left my apartment, I went to my desk. I opened the top drawer and took out a standard white envelope. It was thin. It did not contain money. It did not contain a heartfelt card. It contained a single sheet of paper that I had printed out earlier that morning. I had debated bringing it. It felt petty. It felt like I was bringing a weapon to a knife fight. But the memory of that anonymous email was itching at the back of my brain. I decided that it was better to be prepared. I slipped the envelope into my clutch purse. It sat there, light as a feather, yet it felt heavy with potential energy. I called an Uber. As I waited on the curb, watching the rain darken the pavement, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I was about to walk into a room full of people who valued net worth over self-worth. People who thought a check for $200,000 was a substitute for parenting. I was about to shake hands with my father, a man who thought my career was embarrassing, and hug my mother, a woman who wanted me to be invisible. The car arrived, a black sedan that smelled of lemon air freshener. I slid into the back seat and gave the driver the address of the yacht club. He whistled low when he heard the destination. He asked if I was going to a wedding. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were kind, tired. I told him no. I told him I was going to a performance. As we drove across the floating bridge, the water of Lake Washington looked like hammered steel under the clouds. I watched the city recede behind me. I thought about the girl who used to study in her car with wet shoes. I thought about the hours I spent under fluorescent lights, learning to track the flow of illicit funds. I thought about the anonymous email. I was not that scared little girl anymore. I was a professional. I was a truth seeker. And as the car turned into the long gravel driveway of the yacht club, flanked by manicured hedges and luxury vehicles, I realized something. I wasn't just attending a party. I was entering a crime scene. I just didn't know who the victim was yet. The clubhouse loomed ahead, a white sprawling structure with flags snapping in the wind. I could see the valet parking cars that cost more than my annual salary. I could see the guests mingling on the covered terrace, holding champagne flutes. I took a deep breath. I checked my purse to make sure the envelope was still there. I told the driver to stop. I stepped out into the damp air. I smoothed my dress. I put on the mask of indifference I wore so well at the office. I told myself I would stay for 1 hour. I would drink 1 glass of wine. I would say congratulations, and then I would leave. I would get back in a car and disappear back into my real life, leaving their fantasy world intact. I was so naive. I walked up the steps to the entrance, the sound of my heels clicking on the stone like the ticking of a clock. I reached for the door handle, unaware that on the other side, the past and the present were about to collide with the force of a head-on collision. I thought I was there to witness a celebration. I was wrong. I was there to witness an execution of character, and I had no idea that I was about to be the one holding the axe. The entrance to the Lake Washington Yacht Club was guarded by a young woman standing behind a podium made of reclaimed driftwood. She was perfectly groomed, with a headset that blinked blue against her ear and a tablet held like a shield. Behind her, the party was already a living, breathing entity. I could hear the murmur of 300 voices blending with the polite sawing of a string quartet. The air smelled of rain, expensive perfume, and roasting meat. I walked up the stone steps, clutching my purse against the side of my navy dress, and stated my name. The hostess smiled, tapped on her screen, and then her smile faltered. She swiped up. She swiped down. She typed something in. The silence that followed was the specific, humiliating silence of exclusion. She looked up at me with a polite confusion that stung worse than rudeness. She told me that she could not find a Stella Watson on the guest list. She asked if perhaps I was a +1 for someone else. I stood there, feeling the wind whip a loose strand of hair across my face. I told her that I was the groom's sister. I told her that my father was the one paying for this event. The hostess looked at me, then back at the party, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman standing in front of her with the VIP family inside. It was a perfect summary of my life. I was a biological fact that had been omitted from the official documentation, before I could insist, or perhaps turn around and leave right then. The double doors swung open. My mother, Diane, hurried out. She was wearing a silver gown that shimmered like fish scales. Her hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet of blonde perfection. When she saw me, her eyes widened, not with relief, but with the frantic energy of a stage manager realizing a prop is in the wrong place. She rushed past the hostess, laughing a high, brittle sound. She told the girl it was a clerical error. She told her that of course I was on the list. She grabbed my elbow. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her nails digging into my skin through the fabric of my dress. She did not hug me. She did not say she was glad to see me. She pulled me through the doors like I was a system glitch that needed to be rebooted before anyone noticed. Inside, the room was an assault of luxury. The ceilings were vaulted, hung with chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls. The tables were draped in heavy white linen and centered with floral arrangements that likely cost more than my first car. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd like ghosts, offering flutes of champagne and tiny, intricate hors d'oeuvres. My mother leaned close to my ear. Her breath smelled of mint and Chardonnay. She hissed at me to smile. She told me to mingle but to keep it brief. She reminded me not to talk about my work. Then she released my arm and fluttered away to greet a local councilman, leaving me standing alone near a towering ice sculpture of a swan. I scanned the room for my father. I found him near the bar, holding court. Richard Watson looked exactly as he always did, imposing, tanned, and radiating the easy confidence of a man who has never had to apologize. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He was laughing at something a man in a gray suit had said, throwing his head back. I took a deep breath and walked toward him. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the childhood desire for approval fighting a losing battle against the adult reality of who he was. He saw me coming. His eyes met mine. For a second, I expected a reaction, a nod, a frown, anything, but his gaze simply slid over me. It was the way you look at a piece of furniture you have seen 1,000 times. He looked through me to the window behind my head, then turned his back to signal the bartender for another drink. He did not extend a hand. He did not introduce me to the circle of men he was talking to. He simply deleted me from his visual field. I stopped walking. I felt a coldness settle over me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I drifted toward the edge of the room, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray just to have something to do with my hands. From my vantage point, I watched the guests. I recognized many of them. There were partners from Everpine Holdings. There were clients I had seen mentioned in business journals. I saw a man named Marcus Thorne, a venture capitalist, who had been at my house for dinner when I was 10. He was standing near me, talking to his wife. I heard him whisper. He asked who I was. His wife murmured something back. He frowned and said he didn't know Richard had a daughter. He thought Richard only had the son, the one who went to that fancy program. The words floated through the air, sharp and clear. I took a sip of water. It tasted metallic. I wasn't a secret. I was a non-entity. Then I saw the bride, Claire Sloane. She was standing near the French doors that led to the terrace. She was breathtaking. She wore a dress that was simple in design but clearly constructed by a master couturier. It moved with her like liquid silk. She was tall, with dark hair that fell in soft waves around her face, but it wasn't her beauty that struck me. It was her posture. She stood with a natural, unforced authority. She was talking to an older woman, listening intently, nodding, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the woman she was speaking with. She looked intelligent. She looked grounded. She looked like she belonged on a stage. But unlike my brother, she didn't look like she was acting. Grant was standing next to her. He looked the part of the golden boy. He was handsome, I will give him that. The tuxedo hid the softness around his middle that came from too many expensed lunches. He was laughing too loud, his hand resting possessively on the small of Claire's back. He looked like he had won a trophy. I watched Claire glance at him. There was a flicker in her eyes, not adoration, but something harder to place. Fatigue, confusion. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a practiced smile. A spoon chimed against a glass. The sound cut through the chatter. The room fell silent. Faces turning toward the front of the room where a small stage had been set up. My father stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted his cufflinks, waited for the perfect beat of silence, and then smiled. It was his boardroom smile, the one he used when he was about to sell you something you didn't need. He began to speak. His voice was rich and warm. He welcomed the guests. He made a joke about the weather. He spoke about family values and legacy. He spoke about how a father's greatest joy is to see his children thrive. I stood in the back, near a pillar, feeling like an intruder in a private play. Then came the toast. My father raised his glass. He looked at Grant. He didn't look at Claire. He looked only at his son. He said that he was raising a glass to Grant Watson. He said that Grant was the culmination of the Watson legacy. And then, he said the sentence that I had been dreading, the sentence that I knew was coming but still hit me like a physical slap. He called Grant his only successful child. He said it clearly. He said it without a stumble. He said it to 300 of the most influential people in Seattle. He erased my degrees. He erased my career. He erased the fact that I had never asked him for a dime while Grant was still suckling at the teat of the family trust. The room erupted in applause. People cheered. Grant beamed, stepping forward to shake his father's hand, accepting the accolade as if he had earned it. I stood frozen. I felt the blood draining from my face. I looked around the room. No one looked at me. No one knew I was there. I was the ghost in the machine. The injustice of it was so absolute, so suffocating, that I felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the insult, it was the lie. They were celebrating a hollow shell, a man bought and paid for by their own money. While I stood there with the truth burning a hole in my pocket, I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay. I had told myself I would close the chapter, but this wasn't closure. This was self-harm. I set my glass down on a passing tray with a little too much force. The waiter startled, but I was already moving. I turned toward the exit. I needed air. I needed to get away from the smell of money and mendacity. I was halfway to the door when I felt eyes on me. It is a sensation you develop in my line of work, the feeling of being watched. I stopped and turned. Across the room, through a gap in the crowd. Claire Sloane was looking at me. She wasn't looking at my face. She wasn't looking at my dress. Her gaze was locked on my right hand. I was clutching my clutch purse against my chest, and my hand was exposed. The silver ring I had bought myself on graduation day, the cheap $80 band with the blue stone, was catching the light from the chandelier. Claire's eyes were wide. She wasn't blinking. It was a look of intense, almost desperate recognition. It wasn't the look of a bride checking out a guest's jewelry. It was the look of someone solving a puzzle. She stepped away from Grant. He tried to grab her arm, to pull her back into the circle of adoration, but she shrugged him off without looking at him. She began to move through the crowd. She moved with purpose, ignoring the people who tried to stop her to offer congratulations. She was coming straight for me. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I thought about the envelope in my purse. I thought about the anonymous email. Did she know? Was she coming to kick me out? She stopped 2 feet in front of me. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were intelligent, sharp, and currently filled with a mixture of shock and something that looked like hope. The noise of the party seemed to fade into a dull roar. I expected her to ask who I was. I expected her to ask why I was crashing her engagement party. I braced myself for the confrontation. I prepared my defense, but Claire didn't ask a question. She looked at my face, then down at my hand again, and then she spoke. Her voice was low, trembling slightly, but the words were clear enough to freeze the blood in my veins. She said, "You are the one who found the missing $3 million in the Archdiocese audit." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. And in that moment, the ground beneath the yacht club shifted. She didn't know me as Grant's sister. She didn't know me as the failure. She knew me by the one thing my father had tried to bury. She knew my work. The air between us seemed to vibrate with a tension that was entirely separate from the rest of the party. The chatter of the guests and the clink of silverware on china faded into a dull background hum. I looked at Claire Sloane, up close. I could see the tiny tremors in her hands. She was not looking at me with the polite curiosity of a bride greeting a guest. She was looking at me with the intensity of someone who has just found a lifeline in the middle of a storm. She took a half step closer, lowering her voice so that only I could hear. She asked me if I was Stella Watson. She did not wait for me to answer. She said the name with a certainty that left no room for debate. She asked it as a confirmation, not a question. I nodded slowly. I did not trust my voice. My throat felt tight, constricted by the sudden, violent shift in reality. I had spent 15 years being invisible to these people, and now The most important person in the room was staring at me as if I were a celebrity. Claire let out a breath that sounded like a sob caught in her chest. She reached out and touched my arm. Her grip was firm, grounding. She told me that she knew me. She told me that she had recognized me the moment she saw me standing in the shadows. But she hadn't been sure until she saw the ring on my finger. She said she remembered that ring. She remembered the way it caught the light under the fluorescent lamps of a deposition room 2 years ago. She began to speak faster, the words tumbling out of her. She talked about the Sloan Horizon Scholarship. It was a charitable fund she had started right after college to help underprivileged kids get into arts programs. 2 years ago, the fund had nearly collapsed. There had been discrepancies. Money was vanishing. The board of directors had blamed her. They had accused her of mismanagement, or worse, embezzlement. She had been on the verge of losing her reputation, her foundation, and her standing in the community. I remembered the case. It was file number 409 on my internal drive. It was a messy case. A trusted financial advisor had been skimming off the top, hiding the theft inside complex vendor payments for consulting fees. I had spent 3 weeks dismantling his ledger. Line by line, I had traced the money through a maze of shell accounts until I found the final destination, a private bank account in the Cayman Islands. I had never met the client personally during the investigation phase that was standard protocol to maintain objectivity, but I had attended the final review meeting where the evidence was presented. I had sat at the end of a long table, wearing my navy suit and my silver ring, and I had laid out the facts that sent a man to prison and saved a foundation. Claire looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She told me that if it weren't for me, she would have lost everything. She said that I was the one who found the needle in the haystack. She said that she had tried to find me afterwards to thank me, but my firm had a strict policy about non-fraternization with clients. She said she never forgot my face. She never forgot the way I explained the fraud with such calm, absolute precision. She said the words that no one in my family had ever said to me. She said thank you. She said I was brilliant. I stood there, stunned. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My father had just stood on a stage and declared me a failure, a non-entity, while the woman he was desperate to impress was standing here telling me I was her savior. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. Before I could respond, a shadow fell over us. Grant had navigated through the crowd. He moved with a jerky, nervous energy. He must have seen Claire leave his side and head toward the sister he was trying to hide. He slid his arm around Claire's waist, a gesture that looked possessive rather than affectionate. He flashed a bright, plastic smile at me, but his eyes were darting around the room, checking to see who was watching. He laughed, a loud, forced sound that grated on my nerves. He asked what we were talking about. He tried to steer Claire away, physically turning her body back toward the main party. He said that he was sure I was boring her. He looked at me with a warning glare that was clear as day. It said, "Shut up." Claire did not move. She planted her feet. She looked up at Grant, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in the perfect facade of the happy couple. She pulled slightly away from his grip. She told him that I wasn't boring her. She told him that we had actually met before. She told him that I was the forensic accountant who had saved her scholarship fund. Grant froze. His smile didn't drop, but it froze in place, looking grotesque. He blinked rapidly. You could see the gears in his head grinding, trying to process this information and spin it in real time. He let out another nervous chuckle. He patted Claire's arm patronizingly. He told her she must be mistaken. He told her that his sister Stella just worked in administration. He said I did data entry for an insurance company. He said I was a support staffer, not an investigator. He said it with such casual dismissal. He didn't even realize he was insulting me. To him, it was just the script. It was the lie he had told so many times that he believed it. He looked at me, expecting me to play along. He expected me to nod and say, yes, just data entry. He expected the insurance policy to remain in the basement. But Claire was not having it. She stepped back from him, breaking his hold completely. Her voice rose, sharp and clear. cutting through the ambient noise of the party. She asked him what he was talking about. She asked him if he even knew what his sister did for a living. She pointed at me. She told him that I was not support staff. She said I was the lead investigator. She said I was the one who deposed the CFO of the consulting firm and made him cry. She said I was the reason she still had a career. The guests nearby stopped talking. Heads turned. The circle of silence expanded outward from us like a ripple in a pond. People love a spectacle, especially at a high society event where everyone is bored by politeness. I saw Marcus Thorne, the venture capitalist, turn his head. I saw the wives of my father's partners lean in. Grant looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to be the big sister who cleans up the mess. But I just stood there, holding my clutch, watching him drown in his own deception. Then, the heavy artillery arrived. My father, Richard Watson, had sensed a disturbance in the force. He cut through the crowd with the efficiency of a shark. He didn't run, but he moved with a speed that suggested crisis management. He arrived at our little triangle, a smile plastered on his face that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He put a hand on Grant's shoulder and another hand reaching out toward Claire, trying to physically corral the situation. He asked if everything was all right. He asked it in a tone that implied everything was definitely all right, and anyone who suggested otherwise was being rude. He looked at me with a gaze that promised retribution later. He tried to usher us toward the buffet. He said that we should not bore the guests with family shop talk. Claire ignored him. She was looking at Grant, and then she looked at my father. The admiration that had been in her eyes earlier when she looked at Richard was gone. It was replaced by confusion and a dawning suspicion. She asked the question that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. She asked why they had hidden this. She asked why, if their daughter was a top-tier forensic accountant who saved charities from fraud. They told everyone she was a clerk. She asked why they had never mentioned my success. My father stiffened. For a man who made a living spinning financial narratives, he was suddenly at a loss for words. He tried to laugh it off. He said that they didn't like to brag. He said that they were proud of all their children in their own ways. He tried to diminish the question by making it seem trivial. I could have stayed silent. I could have let him spin it. I could have walked away and let them have their night. But I looked at Grant, sweating in his tuxedo. I looked at my father, terrified that his perfect image was cracking. And then I looked at Claire, a woman who valued the truth. I realized that keeping their secret was not an act of loyalty. It was an act of complicity. I was tired of being an accomplice to my own erasure. I spoke. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used in boardrooms when I was explaining to a CEO that his company was insolvent. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply stated the facts. I looked at Claire and told her that I worked for the Cascadia Financial Integrity Office. I told her that my title was Senior Forensic Analyst. I told her that yes, I was the lead on the Sloan Horizon case, and I was glad that the fund was doing well. The words hung there. They were simple, professional sentences. But in the context of my family's lies, they were revolutionary. I saw the color drain from my father's face. He knew what that title meant. He knew that the people in this room knew what that title meant. Cascadia was not a place for data entry clerks. It was a place for sharks. Grant tried to laugh again, but it came out as a wheeze. He muttered something about how I liked to make things sound more dramatic than they were. Claire turned to look at him. It was a look I will never forget. It was the look of a woman seeing a stranger wearing her fiancé's face. She looked at his sweating forehead. She looked at his shifting eyes, and then she looked back at me, standing tall and calm in my navy dress. The connection was made. If he lied about this, about something so easily verifiable, about something that should be a source of pride, what else was he lying about? I saw the realization hit her. It wasn't just about my job. It was about the character of the men standing next to her. She stepped back, creating a physical distance between herself and the Watson men. The party was still going on around us. The string quartet was playing a waltz. The waiters were pouring champagne, but in our little circle. The party was over. The music had stopped. The lights had been turned up too bright. I looked at my father. His eyes were wide with panic. He was looking around the room, trying to see who had heard. He wasn't worried about my feelings. He was worried about his stock price. He was worried about the merger. He was worried about the narrative. I felt a strange sense of peace. I tightened my grip on my purse, feeling the sharp corner of the envelope inside. I hadn't even used it yet. I hadn't even pulled out the evidence I had brought. The truth had simply walked up to me and introduced itself. I realized then that I didn't need to burn the house down. The foundation was already rotten. All I had to do was stand there and let gravity do the rest. Claire looked at me one last time. She didn't say anything, but her eyes asked a question. Who are these people? And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to cover for them. I just held her gaze, steady and unblinking, and let her find the answer for herself. The first domino had fallen. The sound of it hitting the floor was deafening. The vibration of my phone against the palm of my hand was not a social notification. I know the haptic pattern of my work phone. It is a sharp, double pulse that cuts through the noise of daily life like a warning shot. It was sitting inside my clutch, pressed against the envelope I had brought, and for a second, I debated ignoring it. I was standing in the middle of a yacht club, surrounded by people who viewed me as a clerical error, having just dropped a tactical nuclear weapon of truth into the middle of a polite conversation. But the pulse came again, urgent, persistent. I excused myself with a nod to Claire, stepping back into the shadow of a large potted fern near the terrace doors. I opened the clutch and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ben, a junior analyst at my office. We had a protocol. We did not text about weather. We only texted if a flag had turned red. The message was short. It read, "There is a Grant Watson popping up in the intake for the Alpha Stream inquiry. Is this a relation?" My stomach dropped. Alpha Stream was a file that had landed on our desks 3 days ago. It was a preliminary investigation into a group selling alternative investment vehicles to high-net-worth individuals. The pitch was classic gray market finance. They promised returns of 15 to 20% in a market that was barely yielding 5. The paperwork was opaque, filled with buzzwords about cryptocurrency arbitrage and offshore real estate development, but lacking any audited financial statements. It was the kind of scheme that targets rich people who think they are too smart to be scammed. I typed back a single word. "Yes," Ben replied instantly with a screenshot of a document. It was a lead list, and there, halfway down the page, was the name Grant Watson. But it was not just the name. Next to it was an email address. It was a personal email, one that looked professional enough to the untrained eye, but I recognized it instantly. It was the same handle Grant had used since his sophomore year of college. It was the email he used to sign up for fantasy football leagues and online gaming accounts. It was indisputably him. I looked up from the phone. Grant was 10 feet away, frantically talking to my father. He was gesturing with his hands. His face flushed. He looked like a man trying to explain why the car had a dent in the bumper. Only the car was his entire life, and the dent was a federal crime. I looked back at the screen. I could not access the full case file from my personal device, nor would I breach protocol to do so. But I did not need classified information to connect the dots. I had the internet. I had the ability to search public records that most people ignore. I opened a browser and typed in the name of the company listed in the Alpha Stream header. Cross-referencing it with Grant's name, the results loaded in less than a second. It was a promotional page for a wealth management seminar held 6 months ago in a hotel ballroom in Bellevue. The banner image showed a group of men in suits standing with their arms crossed, looking dynamic and aggressive, and there, second from the left, was my brother. The caption underneath didn't list him as a student. It didn't list him as an intern. It listed him as Director of Client Relations. My thumb hovered over the screen. Director. That was a title that required a buy-in. In these types of organizations, you do not get hired into that role. You purchase it. You bring capital to the table, and they give you a fancy title so you can go out and recruit more capital from your friends and family. I thought about the check. the $200,000, for 15 years. The narrative had been that the money was for tuition. My parents had told everyone Grant was attending a prestigious, specialized business program on the East Coast. We had all assumed the money went to a university bursar, but as I looked at the timeline on the seminar page, the math began to warp. The dates of his supposed graduation did not align with any accredited program's academic calendar. The alumni page of the prestigious program he claimed to attend was public. I quickly navigated to it. I searched for Grant Watson. No results found. I searched for the graduating class of that year. I scrolled through the names. There were 3 Grants. None of them were a Watson. A cold realization washed over me. It was so simple that it was breathtaking. The $200,000 was never for tuition. You do not pay $200,000 for a degree that leaves no paper trail. You pay $200,000 to make a problem go away, or to buy your way into a game you have no business playing. My father hadn't just paid for an education, he had funded a cover-up or a delusion. I looked up. Claire had not gone back to Grant's side. She was standing near the buffet table, holding a glass of champagne that she wasn't drinking. She was watching me. She saw me staring at my phone. She saw the way my jaw had set. She set her glass down and walked back over to me. She moved with a determination that scared me slightly. This was not a woman who wanted to be comforted. This was a woman who wanted the autopsy report. She stopped close to me, her voice barely a whisper, forcing me to lean in. She told me that Grant said he was studying late every night for 2 years. She said he told her the program was so intense he couldn't even come home for Christmas. She looked at me with eyes that were wide and searching. She told me that she had never seen his diploma. She said that every time she asked to see it, just out of curiosity, he made a joke about how it was just a piece of paper and he had lost it in a move, or it was in storage, or it was at his parents' house. I looked at her, and I saw the doubt that had been festering in her for months. I wasn't planting a seed. I was watering a forest that was already growing. She asked me if I thought he actually finished the program. I didn't have to answer. My silence was loud enough. I looked at the screenshot on my phone again. The director title, the shady investment group, the lie about the degree. It was a house of cards built on a swamp. Before I could speak, Grant materialized. He had clearly realized that leaving his fiancée alone with the forensic accountant's sister he had lied about was a tactical error. He rushed over, grabbing Claire's hand with a grip that looked painful. He was sweating profusely now. The collar of his shirt was damp. He told Claire that she had to come meet someone. He said that Senator Miller was here and he wanted to say hello. He tried to pull her away, his voice high and frantic. He was trying to use the social pressure of a VIP introduction to override the conversation we were having. He was trying to dazzle her with names so she wouldn't look at the numbers. Claire did not move. She pulled her hand back, hard. She told him to wait. She told him she was talking to his sister. Grant looked at me. His eyes were wide, manic. He asked me what I was telling her. He accused me of trying to ruin his night. He said I was always jealous. He was reverting to the childhood dynamic, trying to paint me as the bitter sibling so that anything I said could be dismissed as envy. I didn't take the bait. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked at him and asked a question. I asked him how his work with Alpha Stream was going. The effect was instantaneous. It was like I had shot him. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he was going to faint. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at Claire, then back at me. He stammered. He asked how I knew that name. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The terror in his eyes was the confirmation. He knew that I knew, and he knew what my job was. He knew that if I was asking about Alpha Stream, it wasn't because I wanted to invest. It was because the sharks were circling. Claire saw his reaction. She looked from me to him. She saw the fear. She saw the guilt. She saw the boy who had never grown up, standing in a tuxedo his father probably bought, terrified because the lights had been turned on. Then, I felt a heavier presence. My father. Richard Watson had watched the exchange from a few feet away. He had seen Grant try to pull Claire. He had seen Claire resist, and he had seen Grant crumble at my question. My father walked over. He didn't stride this time. He walked slowly. He looked at Grant, who was practically hyperventilating. Then he looked at me. For 34 years, my father had looked at me with varying degrees of dismissal, disappointment, and indifference. He had looked at me as a liability. He had looked at me as a failure. But as he stood there in the middle of the yacht club, surrounded by the empire of lies he had constructed, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. He was afraid. He looked at my calm face. He looked at the phone in my hand. He looked at the way Claire was standing next to me, aligned with the truth rather than the family, and he realized that the insurance policy he had left in the basement had not just survived, it had become the auditor. He realized that the $200,000 check he had written 15 years ago had not bought him a successful son. It had bought him a ticking time bomb. And I was the one holding the detonator. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let him see that I knew. I let him see that the books were open, and the numbers were not adding up. And for the first time in his life, Richard Watson did not know how to close the deal. My father's fear was a palpable thing, a cold front that had moved into the warm, scented air of the yacht club. But before he could say a word, a hand clamped around my upper arm. It was my mother. Her grip was desperate, her fingernails digging into my flesh through the fabric of my dress with a frantic strength I did not know she possessed. She did not look at my father. She did not look at Grant, who was currently disintegrating in front of his fiancée. She looked only at me. Her eyes wide and swimming with a mixture of terror and pleading. She pulled me. It was not a gentle guide. It was a physical drag. She hauled me away from the center of the room, away from the silent circle of judgment that had formed around us, and steered me toward a small, dimly lit alcove near the kitchen service entrance. It was a space designed for waiters to stack trays and for musicians to take breaks, hidden from the glitz of the main floor by a heavy velvet curtain. The sounds of the party, the clinking glasses, the murmur of voices, the string quartet playing Vivaldi were muffled here, turning into a distant, mocking soundtrack. My mother released my arm and leaned back against the wall, her chest heaving. The composure she had worn like a suit of armor for 30 years had shattered. Her face was pale, her lipstick bleeding slightly into the fine lines around her mouth. She looked at me, and for the first time, I did not see the polished vice president of public relations for the Watson family. I saw a woman who was drowning. She begged me to leave. Her voice was a ragged whisper. She told me to go, right now, to walk out the back door and get in a car and vanish. She said that I had made my point. She said that everyone saw me. She said that if I stayed, everything was going to break, and she didn't think they could put it back together this time. I looked at her. I felt a strange detachment, the kind of clinical numbness that takes over when I'm analyzing a particularly brutal set of bank statements. I stood straight, my back not touching the wall, maintaining the posture of an interrogator. I asked her a simple question. I asked her if she knew what I did for a living. My mother flinched. She looked down at her silver shoes. She nodded slowly. She admitted that she knew. She said she had Googled me years ago. She had seen the articles. She had seen the case summaries. She knew I wasn't a clerk. She knew I wasn't an assistant. She knew I was a hunter of financial truth. I asked her why she never said anything. She looked up. Her eyes rimmed with red. She said she was afraid. She said that my father lived in a world where he was the sun, and we were just planets orbiting him. She said that acknowledging my success, my real success, would have required acknowledging that his method, his entire philosophy of investing in the son and discarding the daughter was wrong. She said she couldn't face the argument. She couldn't face the disruption. So she pretended. She pretended I was small so that he could feel big. I listened to this confession with a cold heart. It was a cowardly admission. But it was not the smoking gun. I needed to know about the money. I needed to verify the timeline that was forming in my head, the timeline that connected Grant's sham career to the check that changed our lives. I stepped closer to her. I lowered my voice. but I filled it with the weight of my authority. I asked her about the $200,000. I asked her to look me in the eye and tell me if that check, the one they wrote with such fanfare 15 years ago, was actually for tuition. My mother squeezed her eyes shut. A tear leaked out, cutting a track through her foundation. She shook her head. She whispered that it started as tuition. She said Grant had gone to the school, but he hadn't lasted. He hadn't just failed classes. Stella, he had gotten into trouble. I pressed her. I asked what kind of trouble. She opened her eyes, and the shame in them was bottomless. She told me there was an incident, a party, property damage, a rental car that ended up in a pool. There were legal fees. There were settlements to keep people quiet. There were payments to the university to prevent an expulsion from becoming a public record. The prestigious program wasn't a degree. It was a rehabilitation project. The money didn't buy education. It bought silence. It bought a clean slate for a boy who kept dirtying every surface he touched. I nodded. It made sense. It fit the pattern of the Alpha Stream profile. Grant was reckless, and my parents were his enablers. But then my mother took a breath, a shuddering gasp that suggested there was more. She reached out and touched my hand, her fingers ice cold. She told me there was something else I needed to know. She said that the $200,000 hadn't been enough. The settlements were expensive, the lawyers were expensive, and 3 years ago, when Grant tried to start his first venture, which failed quietly before this current one, he needed more capital. My father was cash poor at that moment, his assets tied up in Everpine stock that he couldn't liquidate without raising eyebrows. She paused, looking at me with a terrified expression. She told me to remember the savings account Grandma had opened for me. I froze. I remembered it perfectly. It was a custodial account, opened by my maternal grandmother when I was born. It was meant to be a nest egg. I had never touched it. I had forgotten about it during my college years because I assumed it was small, or that my parents were managing it. I had never received a statement. My mother told me that my father had access to it as the custodian. She said that 3 years ago, he drained it. He took 90% of the funds. He used it to bail Grant out of a debt involving a gambling problem that he had disguised as a business loss. My mind raced back to 3 years ago. I was applying for a car loan, my first new car after driving beaters for a decade. The loan officer had called me, confused. He said my credit score had taken a sudden, inexplicable dip. He said there was a utilization spike, a co-signed obligation that had defaulted briefly before being brought current. I had panicked. I had disputed it. I had assumed it was identity theft. The bank had eventually cleared it up, calling it a reporting error linked to a familial association. I had been too busy with a massive fraud case at work to dig deeper. I had let it go. Now, standing in the service alcove of a yacht club, the pieces clicked into place with the precision of a locking mechanism. It wasn't a reporting error. It was my father. He hadn't just neglected me. He hadn't just ignored me. He had cannibalized me. He had used my name, my credit, and the money left for me by his mother-in-law to feed the insatiable hunger of his son's failures. I felt a physical blow to my chest, but I did not stumble. I stared at my mother. The betrayal was so total, so comprehensive, that it transcended anger. It became clarity. They had stolen from me. They had stolen my safety net to weave a parachute for Grant. My mother began to cry in earnest now. Ugly, gasping sobs. She grabbed my hands, trying to pull them to her chest. She said she was sorry. She said she had stayed silent for too long. She said she thought that keeping the peace was the same thing as loving me. She thought that if she just kept everyone calm, if she just smoothed over the rough edges, we could be a family. But she realized now that she wasn't keeping the peace. She was aiding and abetting a robbery. She admitted that she had betrayed me. I pulled my hands away. I did not do it violently, but I did it with a finality that she understood. I stepped back. I smoothed the front of my dress. I checked my reflection in the darkened glass of the service door. I looked calm. I looked like I was ready to give a deposition. I did not scream at her. I did not list her failures. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional outburst that she could later dismiss as hysteria. I gave her the truth. I told her that if the truth came out tonight, if the roof caved in on this party and on this family, she needed to understand one thing clearly. I told her it would not be because of me. I was not the demolition crew. I was just the building inspector. I told her that they had built this life on a foundation of lies and theft, and gravity was finally doing its job. I turned away from her. I could hear her weeping behind me, a soft, pathetic sound that no longer had the power to move me. I reached into my purse and touched the envelope again. It felt different now. Before, it was just evidence of Grant's lies. Now, it felt like a receipt. I was going back out there. I wasn't just going to expose a fraud. I was going to collect what was owed. Not the money I didn't want, their tainted money. I was going to collect my dignity, and I was going to take it out of their hides. I pushed aside the velvet curtain and stepped back into the light of the party. The music was still playing. The champagne was still flowing. But as I walked back toward the terrace, toward Claire and Grant and my father, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The predator had returned to the tank, and this time, she was hungry. I emerged from the shadows of the service alcove just as the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. The feedback squeal cut through the room, a sharp electronic shriek that silenced the polite murmurs of 300 guests. The MC was a polished man with teeth that looked too white to be natural. He smiled at the crowd and announced that it was time to hear from the bride-to-be. He invited Claire Sloane to the stage to say a few words. The applause was polite, rhythmic, and entirely scripted. It was the sound of wealthy people performing their social duty. I stood at the back of the room, near a column wrapped in white ivy. My mother was somewhere behind me, likely fixing her makeup and composing a mask of stability. But I was not looking for her. I was watching Claire. She walked to the small stage with a grace that was almost militant. She did not look at Grant, who was standing to the side, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. She did not look at my father, who was standing near the front table, swirling his scotch and looking like a man who was ready for the night to be over. Claire adjusted the microphone stand. She looked out at the sea of faces, the partners, the investors, the social climbers, and she smiled. It was a beautiful smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were cold, hard flint. She began with the expected pleasantries. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked the Watsons for hosting such a magnificent evening. She praised the flowers and the venue. The guests nodded, lulled into a sense of security. They thought they knew this script. They thought this was the part where she gushed about how lucky she was to be marrying into such a prestigious family. Then, she stopped. She took a breath, and the pause stretched out just long enough to make people uncomfortable. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming serious and intimate. She said that before she talked about her future, she wanted to talk about a moment from her past. She said she wanted to tell a story about honesty. The room went still. People sensed the shift. The waiters stopped pouring wine. Claire spoke about the Sloan Horizon Scholarship. She described the passion she had poured into it. Then she described the terror she felt 2 years ago when the funds began to disappear. She talked about the accusations. She talked about the feeling of drowning in paperwork, knowing someone was stealing from her but not being able to prove it. She described the forensic audit that saved her life. She paused again. She looked directly at me. I was standing in the shadows, but her gaze acted like a spotlight. She said that the person who saved her foundation was in the room tonight. She said that for the last hour, she had been told that this person was an administrative assistant. She had been told this person did data entry. She had been told this person was a background character in the Watson family success story. Claire raised her hand and pointed straight at me. She announced my name clearly, Stella Watson. She did not stop there. She announced my full title. She told the room that I was a senior forensic analyst at the Cascadia Financial Integrity Office. She emphasized the word integrity. 300 heads turned. The sound of fabric rustling was the only noise in the room. I felt the collective gaze of Bellevue society hit me. It was a physical weight, but I did not shrink. I stood tall. I held my clutch purse with the evidence inside. I looked back at them. I saw confusion. I saw curiosity. And in the eyes of the men who knew what Cascadia was, I saw respect. Claire did not let them look away. She turned her gaze to the front table. She looked at my father, Richard Watson. She asked a question that was simple, brutal, and impossible to answer without self-incrimination. She asked why the family was hiding the accomplishments of their daughter. She asked why. In a family that prided itself on success, my career was treated like a shameful secret. My father's face turned a color I had never seen before, a mottled, sickly gray. He set his glass down on the table with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He stepped forward, waving his hand in a dismissal gesture. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. He spoke over the murmurs that were starting to rise from the tables. He said that this was not the time for shop talk. He said that Claire was emotional. He tried to steer the narrative back to the engagement. He tried to close the Pandora's box that Claire had just ripped open, but the box would not close. A man in the front row stood up. I recognized him immediately. It was Arthur Sterling. He was the chairman of a major investment bank in Seattle, a man whose net worth made my father look like a pauper. He was a legend in the financial world. He was also a man who hated fraud with a religious passion. Arthur Sterling turned to look at me. He spoke loudly, his voice booming without a microphone. He said he knew me. He said he had seen me present at the Pacific Northwest Anti-Fraud Summit last year. He told the room that my presentation on shell company structures was one of the most brilliant things he had ever heard. He looked at my father and said that Richard should be incredibly proud to have a daughter who was one of the top investigators on the West Coast. The room erupted into whispers. The narrative was crumbling. The guests were looking from Arthur Sterling to me, and then to my father. The social validation from a man of Sterling's caliber was undeniable. My father could dismiss me, but he could not dismiss Arthur Sterling. The lie was exposed, stripping my father of his credibility in real time. Grant could not handle it. He was watching his world dissolve. He saw Claire looking at me with admiration. He saw the most powerful man in the room praising me. He saw his father shrinking. The spotlight that he had hogged for 30 years was shifting. And he reacted with the petulant rage of a child who has had his toy taken away. He lunged for the microphone. He practically ripped it out of the stand. The feedback screeched again, painful and jagged. Grant's face was slick with sweat. His eyes were wild. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He shouted into the mic. He accused me of ruining everything. He said I was always like this. He said I was jealous. He said I had been jealous since we were kids because he was the special one. He screamed that I was trying to sabotage his happiness because I was bitter and alone. He called me a liar. He tried to paint me as the villain, the vindictive sister who couldn't stand her brother's success. It was a pathetic display. It was the tantrum of a man who has never had to fight a fair battle in his life. The guests recoiled. This was not the charming, successful Grant Watson they had been sold. This was a desperate, angry man-child. Claire looked at him. She did not look afraid. She looked disgusted. She stepped closer to him, invading his space. She did not need the microphone because the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. She asked him to stop. She told him that jealousy had nothing to do with it. She asked him to explain something to her. She asked him to explain why, if he was so successful. He had never shown her his degree. She asked him why. Whenever she brought up his graduation, he changed the subject. Grant froze. He stammered. He tried to back away, but the edge of the stage was behind him. Claire did not let up. She pressed forward. She asked him about the company name she had just learned. She asked him about Alpha Stream. She asked him why his name was listed as a director for a company that sold high-risk, unverified financial products. She asked him if that was where the wedding money was coming from. The name Alpha Stream rippled through the crowd. I saw several men in the audience reach for their phones. These were investors. They knew the market. They knew the whispers about Alpha Stream. It was a toxic brand. To be associated with it was social suicide. To be a director of it was a liability. Grant looked at the crowd. He saw the phones coming out. He saw the skepticism. He looked at my father, begging for help. But my father was staring at the table, defeated. Grant looked back at Claire. He opened his mouth to lie, to spin another story, to promise that it was all a misunderstanding. But he couldn't get the words out. The weight of the truth was crushing him. He dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the room. That was my cue. I walked forward. I did not rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who is walking into a courtroom to deliver the closing argument. I walked past the staring guests. I walked past Arthur Sterling, who gave me a nod of respect. I walked past my father, who could not even lift his head to look at me. I stepped up onto the stage. I stood next to Claire. I looked at Grant. He was trembling. He looked small. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a frightened fraud. I did not scream. I did not gloat. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out the white envelope. I held it in my hand, tapping it rhythmically against my palm. I looked at the crowd. Then I looked at my brother. I spoke into the silence. My voice was calm, clear, and terrifyingly reasonable. I didn't need the microphone. My voice carried to the back of the room. I asked him a single question. I asked him if he wanted to tell them the truth about the check, or if he wanted me to do it for him. I asked him if he wanted to explain to his investors and his fiancée exactly what the $200,000 15 years ago had actually purchased. Grant looked at the envelope. He knew what was inside. He knew that I knew, and in that moment, the power dynamic of our entire lives flipped completely. He was no longer the project. He was the suspect, and I was no longer the backup plan. I was the judge. I did not scream. I did not throw the envelope. I did not let a single crack appear in the professional veneer I had spent 15 years perfecting. I stood on that stage, the wood smooth beneath my heels, and I looked out at the room. It felt less like a party and more like a courtroom where the jury had just taken their seats. I held the envelope in my left hand, visible but unopened. I did not need to open it. The threat of what was inside was far more powerful than the paper itself. I spoke to the room, my voice steady and amplified by the acoustics of the high ceiling. I told them that I was not going to disclose confidential information from a pending investigation, because that would be a violation of my oath. I told them that everything I was about to say was a matter of public record. It was information available to anyone with an internet connection and the will to look. I told them that the man standing next to me, the man they had been toasting as a success story, was currently listed as a director for a company called Alpha Stream. I let the name hang in the air for a moment. I saw heads nodding in the back. The investors knew. They knew Alpha Stream was a black hole. I continued. I stated clearly that according to verifiable employment records and tax filings, Grant Watson had not held a legitimate, salaried position in 4 years. I stated that the dates of his alleged graduation from the prestigious East Coast program coincided perfectly with a series of civil settlements filed in the state of Massachusetts for property damage and negligence. I looked at the crowd and told them that the timeline of success they were celebrating was, in fact, a timeline of liability management. Then I turned to Grant. He was trembling so hard that the ice in his glass would have been rattling if he hadn't already dropped it. I looked him in the eye. I didn't see my brother. I saw a suspect who had run out of alibis. I asked him the question that cut the deepest. I asked him when he was planning to tell Claire that the $200,000 was not tuition. I asked him when he was going to tell her that the money our parents called an investment in his future was actually a payment to keep him out of a courtroom. Grant opened his mouth. He looked like a fish on a dock, gasping for air that wasn't there. He couldn't speak. The lie was too big, and his throat was too tight. He spun around, looking for the only person who had ever saved him. He looked for our father. Richard Watson stepped forward. It was a reflex. For his entire life, his instinct had been to cover for his son. He walked up to the edge of the stage, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace of pain. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. He told the room that this was all a misunderstanding. He said that siblings have rivalries and that sometimes details get confused. He tried to frame it as a family spat, a moment of high emotion that we would all laugh about tomorrow. He tried to use his reputation as a shield to protect the glass house he had built, but he had forgotten about the third person on the stage. Claire Sloane moved. She didn't move toward Grant. She moved toward the microphone stand that Grant had knocked over. She picked it up. She set it straight. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Richard. She looked straight at Grant. She reached into her purse, which was sitting on a small table near the edge of the stage. She pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't an envelope like mine. It was a brochure, a glossy, trifold brochure with the Alpha Stream logo on the front. She held it up. She told the room that 2 weeks ago. Grant had sat her down. She said he had told her that they should be smart about their future. He had told her that the money her parents had given them for the wedding and the money she had saved in her own accounts shouldn't just sit in a bank. He had told her about an exclusive opportunity. He had pitched her on Alpha Stream. The gasp from the room was audible. It was a sharp intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the yacht club. Pitching a scam to strangers is one thing. Pitching a scam to your fiancé, trying to defraud the woman you claim to love before the wedding cake is even cut, is a level of depravity that even this room full of sharks couldn't stomach. Claire looked at Grant. Her voice was shaking, not with sadness, but with a cold, hard fury. She said that she had almost signed the transfer papers. She said she had trusted him because he was a Watson, and Watsons were supposed to be successful. She said she had almost handed over her life savings to a Ponzi scheme because he told her it was a sure thing. Grant tried to reach for her. He said her name. He sounded pathetic. He said it was an investment. He said he was trying to help them build a nest egg. Claire didn't scream. She didn't slap him. She did something far more permanent. She raised her left hand. She took hold of the diamond ring on her finger, the ring my father had likely paid for. Or perhaps it was bought with money drained from another one of my hidden accounts. She slid it off. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was efficient. She placed the ring on the table next to her purse. The metal made a small, sharp click against the wood. She looked at him and said 5 words that ended his life as he knew it. She said she would not marry a stranger. That was the breaking point. The social contract that held the room together snapped. The polite silence dissolved into chaos. A man in a gray suit, a partner at a firm my father did business with, stepped forward from the crowd. He didn't look at Grant. He looked at Richard. He raised his voice. He asked Richard if he knew. He said that Grant had invited him to lunch last week to discuss an opportunity. He said Grant had used Richard's name to validate the Alpha Stream pitch. He asked Richard directly if he was aware that his son was trading on the Everpine reputation to peddle high-risk garbage. My father stood frozen. He looked at the partner. He looked at Arthur Sterling, who was shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment. He looked at the room full of people who had trusted him, people whose money he managed. He realized in that split second that the image he had spent 40 years building, the image of the prudent, successful family man CFO, was disintegrating. He wasn't just the father of a failure anymore. He was the accomplice to a fraud. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. He looked old. Suddenly, violently old. Then, from the shadows near the ivy-covered column, a figure emerged. It was my mother. Diane Watson had spent her entire married life in the background. She was the peacekeeper, the enabler, the woman who smiled while her soul was being eroded. But tonight, seeing her husband broken and her son exposed, something in her shifted. She walked toward the stage. She didn't look at the men. She walked until she was standing in front of me. The room went quiet again, waiting for her defense. They expected her to yell at me. They expected her to tell me I was a bad daughter for ruining the party. Instead, my mother began to cry. It wasn't the polite weeping she did at funerals. It was raw. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, she really saw me. She didn't see the insurance policy. She saw the woman who had survived despite her. She spoke loud enough for the front rows to hear. She apologized. She didn't just say sorry. She admitted it. She said she had been afraid. She said she was so terrified of rocking the boat that she had let me drown. She admitted that her silence was the weapon that had hurt me the most. She said that by trying to protect the image of the family, she had destroyed the reality of her daughter. I looked at her. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I was not ready to forgive. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment. But I acknowledged her. I nodded. It was a small movement, but it was the most I could give. I did not hug her. I did not tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. I turned to the microphone one last time. I looked at my father, who was staring at the floor. I looked at Grant, who was staring at the ring Claire had left on the table. And I looked at my mother, who was weeping with her hands over her face. I set a boundary. I spoke clearly. I told them that I was done being the secret. I told them that I was done being the backup plan. I said that if they wanted to have a relationship with me in the future, if they ever wanted to know their daughter again, they had to come to me with the truth. I told them not to come to me with their reputation. I told them not to come to me with their image. I told them to come to me only when they were ready to be honest. I stepped off the stage. I walked over to Claire. I didn't say anything. I just nodded to her. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement between two women who had just survived the same shipwreck. Then, I turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the party collapsed. I heard the sound of voices rising in anger. I heard Grant trying to argue with someone. I heard the sound of a glass breaking. But I didn't look back. I walked out into the cool, rainy night. The air tasted clean. It tasted like the truth. The aftermath was swift and brutal. I didn't stay to watch it, but the news travels fast in our circles. The party ended within 20 minutes of my departure. Grant reportedly slipped out through the kitchen. Avoiding the investors he had tried to swindle, he didn't go back to his apartment because Claire had already called the building security to have his access revoked. He disappeared into the night, a man with no job, no fiancé, and no credibility. My father's fall was less physical, but more total. By Monday morning, the rumors had solidified into facts. The association with Alpha Stream, even if he wasn't legally implicated, was toxic. Clients began to pull their portfolios from Everpine. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. He was asked to take an early retirement. It was a polite firing. He lost the office. He lost the status. He lost the only thing he had ever truly loved, his standing in the world. My mother did something surprising. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't try to host a dinner party to smooth things over. She checked herself into a therapy retreat in Arizona. She sent me a letter, not a text. She said she was trying to learn how to be a person, not just a wife. She said she hoped one day she would be strong enough to be my mother. I went back to work. I sat at my desk at the Cascadia Financial Integrity Office. I opened the files. I tracked the numbers. I did my job. But something was different. I wasn't working to prove them wrong anymore. I was working because it was who I was. I was free. 3 days after the party, my phone buzzed. It was late, almost 11 at night. I was sitting on my balcony, drinking tea, looking at the city lights. I looked at the screen. It was a text from my father. It was short. It didn't have a subject line. It didn't have an excuse. It just said, "Can we talk?" I looked at the words. I thought about the 18-year-old girl standing in the kitchen, watching him write a check for $200,000 to a boy who didn't deserve it. I thought about the years of silence. I thought about the fear I saw in his eyes at the yacht club. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't call him immediately. I typed a response. I wanted him to know that the dynamic had changed. I wasn't waiting for his permission anymore. He was waiting for mine. I wrote, "When you are ready to listen, I will be here." I hit send. I put the phone down. I took a sip of my tea. The silence on my balcony wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. I had stopped shielding them from the consequences of their own actions, and in doing so, I had finally saved myself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey from that kitchen in Bellevue to where I am now, and I appreciate you walking this path with me. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from your car, your office, or maybe from a quiet corner of your home like I used to? Please drop a comment below and let me know your location and your thoughts on how this ended. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice and truth, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this message with more people who might need to hear it. Stay strong, and always trust your instincts.